We continue in this session with Chapter 3 of The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. The president gave Bazart little peace, often summoning him to his office on the bellboy the lawyer wore everywhere except in church. I'm assuming bellboy was some kind of beeper. The two men were spending a good deal of time together. Refuting Dean on the specifics was not enough, Nixon said. There was a more general problem. The administration's legitimate national security operations were being deliberately entangled by his enemies in Watergate. Those activities had to be separated from the scandal. Nixon said he knew that surreptitious entries and wiretaps, after all, that was what Watergate was all about, wasn't it, were a way of life in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. I know this has been going on for 20 years. It is the worst kind of hypocrisy for the Democrats to make so much of it. Thinking about stories he had heard on the Hill, Bazart agreed with the president. But the problem was to document the abuses of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations in the same way that the Urban Committee was presently calling the Nixon administration to account. Nixon pointed out that he had asked John Dean, of all people, quote, of all people, to come up with a list of his predecessors' abuses. But Dean, usually so thorough, hadn't really come up with much. The FBI didn't have records on the blatantly political work done for the Democratic administrations, Bazart said, and certainly did not keep records of illegal break-ins. However, he had heard from good FBI sources that congressmen had been tapped during the 1960s. Was there any way to prove it? Nixon wanted to know. Bazart was sure there was not, but the FBI did have records of national security taps, and there must have been some abuses. There had to be a way to make the other side pay the price, Nixon said. This was a partisan battle. Dean was going to tell the world about his White House. What he said should be measured against the record of prior administrations. Get a comprehensive list of all the national security wiretaps conducted by the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, Nixon ordered. Call the Attorney General and get the Justice Department started on it now. Bazart found that Elliot Richardson was reluctant to cooperate. Bazart therefore took the heat from the president for a while, but eventually he passed it back to Richardson. After the fourth call to the Attorney General, Richardson, a list came back. It was impressive, as Nixon had predicted. Though incomplete, it was political dynamite. The same kind of taps that had caused Nixon grief. The president might be right, Bazart concluded. Nixon was elated. There had been hardly a hint in the press. Fascinated by the fact that many of the taps had been authorized by former Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the president read the list with delight. Lloyd Norman, Pentagon and military affairs correspondent for Newsweek, supposedly ordered by President John F. Kennedy himself because Norman had obtained classified information. Hanson W. Baldwin, military affairs specialist for the New York Times. Robert Amory, Jr., the former number 3 man in the CIA and a close personal friend of President Kennedy. He had reportedly been a close friend of a Yugoslavian embassy official who was an undercover intelligence officer. The law firm of Surrey and Karasik, which had lobbied for Dominican Republic sugar interests and was under investigation for trying to raise the United States sugar quotas. Bernard Fall, the late French historian and author of 7 books on Vietnam, who had interviewed and maintained contact with North Vietnam's President Ho Chi Minh over a period of years. The chief clerk to the House Agriculture Committee, who had worked for Representative Harold D. Cooley, Democrat of North Carolina, after the committee had handled sugar quota legislation. Bazart was sure there were more taps on the Hill, but they could at least document these. Nixon continued his reading. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., that had been extensively reported. Frank A. Capel, the right-wing author of The Secret Story of Marilyn Monroe, a book published in 1964 which alleged a relationship between Robert Kennedy and the late movie actress. The president chortled. The Capel tap surely didn't sound like a national security matter to him. It confirmed everything he had always suspected about the Kennedys. He could stand on his record. He had taken the extreme action of wiretapping staff and reporters only in cases where secret negotiations were in jeopardy. He was not the sort of man who would tap a writer who had written about his private life. Kennedy's, not Nixon's, did that sort of thing. Could Bazart get a list of all the illegal break-ins? conducted during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations? Buzard explained again that the agencies were very unlikely to have kept records of blatantly illegal activities. There was just no way he could get a list. All right, Nixon said, leak the Kennedy wiretaps. Buzard went to Haig. They both thought that leaking the information was too obvious a strategy. Instead, they released without any names a statistical summary of national security wiretaps that had been conducted under the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations. It indicated that there had been fewer under Nixon than under his Democratic predecessors. The president was not satisfied. He pushed Buzard again and again to leak the names of those tapped during the two preceding administrations. It was not a very good idea, Buzard insisted. It could backfire. It might well appear to be one more use of the FBI files for political advantage. Nixon said he wanted it done. He would not tolerate defiance. He had not asked for Buzard's opinion. Buzard and Haig stalled. The president called from California. Dean was going before the Senate Watergate Committee in a few days. Nixon was screaming, I want that out. I haven't read it in the newspaper. I don't want excuses. Do it. Buzard and Haig conferred. There was also pressure from other senior White House staff members. Anything that happened in this administration happened in spades in others, Haig told selected reporters. He knew very well that there had been a consistent pattern of executive abuse under the Kennedy and Johnson regimes, but he couldn't figure out how to get the message out more specifically. If they leaked the details, they would be pulled ever deeper into a partisan crossfire. There was no way to make the public focus on past administrations, not while the current one was being attacked daily in the press or in some congressional investigation or another. Nevertheless, Haig told Buzard, he was not sure he or anyone else could control the president on this particular matter. All they could do was stall. When the president got back from California, it was Buzard who reopened the subject. He laid out his reasoning patiently. It wouldn't do any good. They would be doing exactly what they had accused the Watergate Committee and others of doing. It just wouldn't fly. At last, the president capitulated. But he knew, the staff knew, and the other side knew that what his people had done was nothing, literally nothing, compared to what had gone on before. They were all innocent. Finally, on June 25th, John Dean appeared in public before the Senate Watergate Committee. He read a 245-page statement that described the, let me say that again, a 245-page statement that described the Watergate cover-up in elaborate detail. Over the next 4 days, Dean fielded questions adeptly, contradicting the president's versions of events with impressive consistency. His story, basically unshakable, held up as an extended accusation against the Nixon White House. Wiretapping, burglary, secret funds, money laundering, enemies lists, dirty tricks, plumbers, physical surveillance, choreographed character assassination, cover-up, obstruction of the federal agencies. But Nixon had been right. Dean's account of the president's participation in the Watergate cover-up rested only on his own recollection of the events. It sounded authentic, but it was legally inconclusive. There was no documentation. Almost in desperation, the Watergate Committee's investigative staff began a series of interviews with so-called satellite witnesses, assistants, secretaries, clerks, and aides who had worked at the White House and for the Committee for the Re-election of the President. These were people who might have seen a memo, overheard a conversation, or kept records that could document Dean's allegations. Each was questioned closely for some small confirmation or denial of the charges against the president. Dean's testimony about pre-Watergate intelligence gathering and political retribution was repeatedly confirmed, but the president had, at least by inference, admitted and justified most of the activities in his statement of May 22nd. The crux of Dean's assertions, the president's direct participation in the cover-up, could not be corroborated. Only 6 relatively minor witnesses remained to be heard before Haldeman and Ehrlichman were to testify. Time was running out for the Watergate Committee. At the White House, things were running according to plan. The president authorized his former chief of staff, Haldeman, to listen to more tapes of White House conversations. Haldeman would be well prepared to undercut Dean's testimony. The threat would soon pass. The temperature was in the 90s in Washington on Friday, July 13th, the day witness Alexander Butterfield was to be interviewed by the Watergate Committee staff. Room G334 in the new Senate office building had only one small air conditioning vent, and it was oppressively hot. A haze of tobacco smoke obscured the pale yellow walls. The chairs were stained with grease from fast food meals. Wastebaskets spilled over with cigarette butts and packages and sandwich wrappings. The faded green carpet was filthy. No janitors had been allowed in for fear that someone might plant an eavesdropping device. Both Butterfield's manner and his memory impressed the committee's junior staff. With his hands folded in front of him, he considered carefully each question that was posed to him. He looked directly at his interrogator. He spoke in calm and even tones. He had resigned his commission as an Air Force colonel to work for Haldeman in the White House. He described precisely and laboriously every aspect of his job as deputy assistant to the president. He seemed to enjoy this rare opportunity to talk about the responsibilities he had been charged with. But his candor and memory were not much help in determining whether it was John Dean or Richard Nixon who was lying. Butterfield's job and his access to the president were matters of routine. He kept the keys and the files. Did you see or hear anything which indicated to you that the president was involved in the alleged effort to keep the facts from the public? Butterfield was asked. No, but the way the White House operated it could have happened, certainly. The witness paused to reflect. Quote, the series of meetings in question with Dean didn't begin until February 1973. I was phasing out of my job and getting ready to leave for the FAA. I can't document anything or prove anything. I don't remember Watergate being anything. The staff, trying to make the most of the situation, turned back to Butterfield's expertise on the president's office routine. The minute detail of material submitted to the committee from Bazart was puzzling. One memorandum listed the times, dates, locations, and participants for all the Dean-Nixon conversations. Another described the substance of Dean's calls and meetings with the president. We received a listing from the White House of the conversations between the president and Dean, which we understand are from the president's diaries, a member of the committee staff said. We have 3 types of backup materials from which these listings could be constructed, Butterfield carefully explained. The switchboard operators kept track of all phone calls to and from the president. Secret Service personnel, ushers, and secretaries record who comes and goes from the president's office. Staff members prepare memos for the president before each formal meeting with outsiders, outline the purpose and points to be covered, and then prepare another memo after each meeting, summarizing the tone of the meetings and any commitments made. End quote. All this was put together into a daily log for the president, where, when, and with whom he had met. Would there be a file on the substance of each meeting with staff members? They asked. If the staff member was in alone, Butterfield said, or only with other White House staff members, there would probably be no memo written. If there was a highly significant meeting, the president might say, write this up. Pulling out a typed transcript of the summary that Bazart had dictated to the Republican Minority Council, the president's version of his conversations with Dean, an investigator asked Butterfield where such an account might have originated. Could it have been from someone's notes of the meetings? Butterfield glanced over the document. He paused several times to remark on how detailed the account was. He appeared to be fascinated by that. He lingered over it. Somebody probably got the information from the Cron file and put it down, he said finally. As he continued to read, he was asked whether the summary described the kinds of meetings the president would ask someone to write up. No. Resuming his reading, Butterfield arrived at the account of the March 21, 1973 meeting and stopped. He noted aloud that the summary stated that Dean had told the president that Hunt was trying to blackmail Ehrlichman. Butterfield was surprised. It was he who pointed out to his questioners that the next sentence included an actual quote. Quote, the president said, how could it possibly be paid? What makes you think he would be satisfied with that? End quote. Where did you get this? Butterfield inquired. Mr. Bazart provided it to the committee. Could it have come from someone's notes of a meeting, he was asked. No, it seems too detailed, Butterfield replied. Was the president's recollection of meetings good? Yes, when I came I was impressed, Butterfield replied. He is a great and fast learner. He does recall things very well. He tends to over-explain things. Was he as precise as a summary? Well, no, but he would sometimes dictate his thoughts after a meeting. How often did he do so? Very rarely. Were his memos this detailed? I don't think so. Where else could this have come from? Butterfield stared down at the document. Slowly, he lifted it an inch off the table. I don't know. Well, let me think about that a while. He pushed the document toward the center of the green felt-covered table. The questioning moved into other areas. Did the president ever note an article in a news summary and write in the margin? Yes. Did he ever write, "Get this guy"? Yes, not necessarily in those words. He is profane, but in a nice sort of way. Do you recall when he said, "Get this guy"? Do you remember the phrase he used? He said several times, "I remember him. He's no good," oftentimes referring to news people, Butterfield said. Sometimes he'd write something like, "Ziegler should get wise to this guy." The questioners went back to Dean's testimony. Don Sanders, the deputy counsel to the Republican minority, thought there might be some way to document the president's innocence. He led to his question cautiously. Dean indicated that there might be some facility for taping. He said that on April 15th in the president's executive office building office, he had the impression he was being taped, and that at the end of the meeting, the president walked to a corner of the room and lowered his voice as if he was trying to stay off the tape himself, while he discussed his earlier conversation with Colson about executive clemency. Is it possible Dean knew what he was talking about? Butterfield thought for a moment, trying to frame a response to the complicated question. Then he leaned over to the center of the table and picked up the bizarre account of the Dean-Nixon meetings. "No, Dean didn't know about it," he said at last. "But that is where this must have come from. There is tape in each of the president's offices. It is kept by the Secret Service, and only 4 other men know about it. Dean had no way of knowing about it. He was just guessing." Then, for 45 minutes, Butterfield described the taping system in detail. When the interview ended, the Democratic staff members raced to brief the Democratic majority's chief counsel, Sam Dash. Dash told them to move cautiously to verify the system's existence before the White House heard about Butterfield's revelation. Meanwhile, a minority staff representative located his boss, Fred Thompson, at a bar in the Carroll Arms Hotel talking to 2 reporters. Thompson called Bizart. The next Monday, Butterfield testified publicly. He concluded his televised testimony by noting, "This matter which we have discussed here today, I think, is precisely the substance on which the president plans to present his defense. I believe, of course, that the president is innocent of any crime or wrongdoing, that he is innocent likewise of any complicity." Gathered around their television sets, members of the White House staff were mesmerized by Butterfield's revelation. Surely this disclosure had been carefully engineered, some thought. There were expressions of relief. At last there was something definitive. The tapes had been deliberately exposed. They would prove that John Dean was lying. The president was in Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland with pneumonia. Bizart, Garment, and University of Texas professor Charles Allen Wright, a constitutional scholar and the newest member of the White House legal team, visited him. They wanted Nixon's permission to review the tapes. Nixon appeared offended. "No, never." He cut off that discussion. "No, no, no," he said, his voice rising. 2 days later, the president was back at the White House. Bizart went to see him. Cox would want the tapes, and Bizart was not at all confident that the president would prevail in a claim of privilege. Remember, Archibald Cox was a special Watergate prosecutor. The special prosecutor had a powerful argument. The tapes were evidence in a criminal prosecution of the president's aides. Nixon was adamant. The indiscretion of installing the tape system should not forever burden the office of the presidency, he told Bizart. No outsider could comprehend the breadth of the intimate material on those tapes. Those tapes were the essence of the presidency. They contained the private thoughts and comments not only of the president, but of foreign leaders, congressmen, his aides, even his family. Bizart must understand. If the president broke the confidence of those who unburdened themselves in his office, it would shatter the presidency, not only his own, but also his successors. What about those Democrats who had come to him to say they supported his reelection? Senators James O. Eastland of Mississippi, Russell Long of Louisiana, and John L. McClellan of Arkansas. Nixon was becoming emotional. Bizart could see he wanted desperately to be believed, that it was crucial that Bizart understand that this decision was a matter of the highest principle. A president's conversations must be protected, Bizart answered. The only solution seemed to be a claim of executive privilege. The problem was no longer academic. On July 23rd, Cox subpoenaed 9 of the president's recorded conversations. Pat Buchanan had a blunter solution: destroy the tapes. He sat at his typewriter in his EOB office and described the advantages of his bonfire approach. There would be a firestorm afterward, but it would blow itself out. The president and the presidency were strong enough to withstand the assault. Buchanan's memo was delivered to the president on the 25th. Nixon read it and summoned Bizard and Haig. They disagreed with Buchanan. It was too late now to destroy them. With the receipt of Cox's subpoena, the tapes had become potential evidence, and destroying them might constitute obstruction of justice, Bizard counseled. Worse, said Haig, destroying the tapes would look like an admission of guilt. There was nothing on the tapes that would hurt him in Watergate, Nixon assured them. At most, there were a few ambiguous statements that might be misconstrued if they were taken out of context. Nothing more. Still, the option occupied the president's thoughts. He sought Garment's counsel. Garment told him it was too late. And now we have reached the end of Chapter 3 of The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And we'll take up in the next session, beginning of Chapter 4. Thank you for watching.